Arthur Dayne remembered the cool steel of dawn against his palm as he awaited the dawn itself on the morning of the Battle of the Trident. The sky overhead was still gray, not yet lit by the rising sun, and the river waters below churned with the uneasy promise of bloodshed. He had been called away from his guarded station near the Tower of Joy by a summons so urgent that only a king could have commanded it. Yet it was not Ares he served that day, not truly. It was the Crown Prince, Rhaegar Targaryen, the man in whose vision Arthur believed despite his own misgivings about the turn the realm had taken under the Mad King. As the first hint of pale light broke across the horizon, he gathered his cloak about him, every sense attuned to the quiet murmurs of the gathered host. Though it was rare for Arthur Dayne to feel hesitation, he could not deny the flicker of apprehension that pulsed in his chest. Dawn, the ancestral sword of House Dayne, felt heavy with the weight of prophecy, of oaths, and of the countless lives it had ended to protect the realm. Nearby, Prince Rhaegar was somber, clad in black armor inlaid with rubies on the breastplate. The rubies glinted faintly, catching the early light, like trapped embers yearning for a spark. Arthur noted a certain resignation in the prince's eyes, a silent acceptance that the course of fate might not be easily altered. The rebel forces stirred across the river, their encampment spread out like a sea of mismatched banners. Robert Baratheon had gathered to his cause Northmen, Vale Knights, Stormlanders, and Riverlords, all bound by their defiance of the Targaryen crown. The stories that had traveled through the night from the scouts told of Robert's formidable presence, how his mere name struck fear into loyalist hearts. Arthur Dayne gazed across the waters, half wishing he could have met the man under different circumstances. A trial of arms for honor's sake alone, rather than a war that threatened to tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. Somewhere behind him, he sensed the presence of other Kingsguard. Ser Jonathan Darry, newly knighted and ill at ease, was speaking in hushed tones with Ser Barristan Selmy, whose eyes missed little. The Lord Commander, Ser Gerald Hightower, was not present, for the king himself had bidden him remain in King's Landing. That absence weighed heavily on Arthur's mind. He felt a pang that the White Bull would not stand at his side on this fateful day. But such was the duty of the Kingsguard. They went where they were most needed, and no man could be everywhere. Prince Rhaegar turned to Arthur then, his voice low, eyes bright with a subtle spark. "Ser Arthur, my friend," he said, "the realm may remember us for what we do today, or it may not remember us at all. I fear a greater destiny lies before us, but not all roads to destiny lead to victory." Arthur inclined his head. "Your grace, victory or defeat, you are my sworn prince. My blade is yours." Rhaegar smiled faintly, a curve of the lips that held little joy. It was then the trumpets began to wail, a discordant cry that echoed off the hills. The Targaryen host was being roused to formation. Squires rushed between tents, shouting orders. Knights hastened to don gauntlets and helms, adjusting sword belts and checking the harnesses of their mounts. Horses stamped the muddy ground, and Arthur could already smell the tang of sweat and leather suffusing the cold air. The prince cast one more lingering glance across the river. On the far bank, Robert Baratheon's standard of the crowned stag whipped in the wind. It was nearly time. Arthur moved to his own horse, a sable stallion with eyes as dark as midnight. He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, dawn sheathed across his back but easy to draw. His white cloak fell in neat folds over the horse's flank, a stark contrast to the gloom of the battlefield. The faint drizzle that had begun in the early hours now fell upon the assembled Targaryen army like tears from a sorrowful sky. Even in the bustle of preparation, Arthur noticed the hush that fell among many of the soldiers as he passed. It was not arrogance to know that the sight of the sword of the morning could still hearts or raise hopes. He was a legend, though he never let himself dwell on such matters. The eyes that watched him now were filled with desperate hope. They counted on him, on Rhaegar, on victory. And so he rode on, a steady pillar of calm amidst the gathering storm, letting none see the tumult within him. At the head of the host, Prince Rhaegar addressed his captains, dividing their forces along the lines predetermined in council. Arthur was to ride in the prince's vanguard, alongside Ser Barristan Selmy. The two of them, considered the greatest knights in all the realm, were to lead the charge when Rhaegar gave the word. Arthur found a sense of reassurance in Ser Barristan's presence, for the older knight was as stalwart as any man could be, and the mutual respect between them was a quiet strength. As the armies aligned, horns blared from the rebel side, signaling that Robert's forces had also begun to move. Their ranks bristled with spears, and the pounding of war drums reverberated through Arthur's chest. A memory flickered in his mind's eye. The Tower of Joy, the dawn sky in the Red Mountains, and a promise made to Prince Rhaegar. He had left Kingsguard brothers behind there, bound to a different duty. He tried to steel himself. He tried not to wonder what might be unfolding in that distant place, and whether his presence here would tip the scales of fate or if it would be in vain. The first clash came just after sunrise. Loyalist archers loosed volleys of arrows, and rebels responded in kind. The sound was a swarm of angry wasps overhead, and the first screams of the fallen rose in dreadful chorus. Still, Rhaegar's trumpets sounded the order to hold. The prince was waiting, scanning the lines for an opening, a chance to break the rebels on the banks of the Trident. Arthur could see the reflection of the morning sun glancing off Robert Baratheon's warhammer, which the rebel lord hefted with effortless might. Without warning, a horn from the loyalist side gave 3 sharp blasts, the signal for the cavalry to advance. Rhaegar's standard-bearer hoisted the 3-headed dragon banner high, and men shouted, "Targaryen," as their horses lurched forward. Arthur felt the surge of adrenaline course through him. He pressed his spurs into his stallion's flanks, urging the beast into a gallop. On his left, Ser Barristan was already leaning forward in the saddle, poised like a hawk about to strike. On his right rode Prince Rhaegar himself, silent and grim. The ride across the field was short, punctuated by the thunder of hooves, the cries of men, and the pounding in Arthur's ears. Mud sprayed in arcs from the hooves of 1,000 horses as they met the rebel vanguard, a contingent from the Stormlands. Arthur drew Dawn in a single fluid motion, the pale blade flashing with an otherworldly sheen in the morning light. He felt a jolt as he crashed into the rebel line. The momentum and weight of the horse did much of the work, but skill and reflex guided Dawn as it tore through leather, steel, and flesh. Arthur's world became a maelstrom of chaos. Shrieking horses, bellowing men, the iron tang of blood on the air. Somehow, in the press of bodies, he glimpsed Ser Barristan carving a path of his own, though the older knight was soon lost amidst the swirl of combat. Around Arthur, loyalist knights joined the fray, driving the rebels back step by step. For a moment, it seemed that this initial charge might succeed, that Rhaegar's discipline and the skill of his Kingsguard could cut the rebel line asunder. But the rebel infantry held firm, wielding long spears that threatened to unseat even the best riders. Arthur's stallion reared, letting out a piercing neigh when a spear grazed its flank. Arthur twisted in the saddle, bringing Dawn down upon the spear wielder, who died without a sound, then spurred his horse forward again, refusing to let momentum ebb. The melee deepened, and Arthur sensed the press from the sides as more rebel forces swept in to protect their vanguard. The clang of steel on steel drowned out almost all else. He found himself fighting in clusters, driving away one foe only to be set upon by 2 more. His arms burned from the effort, but his mind was a calm sea amid the tempest, each movement practiced and efficient. He never drew breath for more than a split second before the next threat presented itself. Catching a moment's reprieve, Arthur scanned the battlefield, his gaze darting across the chaos. Where was the prince? He spotted a flash of black armor in the distance and the gleam of rubies. Rhaegar was engaged in fierce combat near the center of the line, surrounded by a knot of his guard. Robert Baratheon, massive and unstoppable, was pushing his way through loyalist ranks, heading straight for Rhaegar. Arthur felt a chill coil in his gut. He knew, as all did, that the outcome of the war might hinge on whether the Crown Prince and the rebel lord would clash, and how that duel would end. Spurring his horse, Arthur attempted to reach Rhaegar's side. Dawn cut a bloody path through men who seemed like little more than shadows, their faces lost to the haze of war. A horn sounded from somewhere, and Arthur was dimly aware that Loyalist foot had begun to engage on the flanks. Though the Targaryen army was larger, the rebels were fighting with a furious passion, as though each man among them believed victory was within reach and that it must be seized here and now. Progress was agonizingly slow. Twice Arthur found himself unhorsed by the crush of bodies. He was forced to fight afoot for precious moments, dawn sweeping in deadly arcs to clear space around him. The mud slicked his boots, threatened to trip him. Yet each time he pressed onward, unwavering in his singular purpose: protect the prince. At last, he found a vantage point on a small rise by the riverside, where the ground was firmer. From there, he spotted Prince Rhaegar locked in combat with Robert Baratheon. The rebel lord's great warhammer crashed again and again, while Rhaegar's sword flashed in riposte. Rubies glinted on Rhaegar's breastplate, a symbol of the royalty he carried and the prophecy he believed in. Arthur felt the pull of fate at that moment, as though something greater than himself was weaving the tapestry of events. In that tapestry, he, the Sword of the Morning, had a part to play. He bounded down the rise, ignoring the burn in his thighs. Blood-slick mud sucked at his boots, but he waded through it, nearly slipping more than once. The clang of steel grew louder with every step, until it was as though his whole world was the ring of metal. Finally, he burst into a pocket of open space. Ahead, Rhaegar and Robert fought in a deadly dance. The prince, tall and elegant, wielded his sword with precision, while Robert, brawny and raw with fury, swung his warhammer like a titan. Their weapons collided with bone-shaking force. For a moment, Arthur was transfixed. He had never seen Robert fight in single combat. The man fought with a savage determination, as if each blow was meant to shatter the very world. Rhaegar moved with grace, turning aside strikes that would fell lesser men. But Arthur's keen knightly eye saw that Rhaegar was tiring. One blow from the warhammer, glancing though it was, had dented Rhaegar's breastplate and cracked 2 rubies. The prince's breath came in ragged heaves. Arthur sprang into action. He circled around Robert, seeking an opening. But Robert was not so easily flanked. Even as he advanced on Rhaegar, he was aware of Arthur's presence. Whirling with surprising agility for a man of his size, he brought the warhammer around in a sweeping arc. Arthur ducked under it, feeling the rush of air that signaled how close the strike had come. He retaliated with a thrust of dawn aimed at Robert's back, but the rebel lord twisted just enough that the blade skittered off his thick armor. A lesser blade might have shattered on such a strike, but dawn held strong, forging a bright scratch across the metal. Rhaegar took the opportunity to press the attack, slashing at Robert's flank. Robert barked a laugh, half in pain, half in wild excitement, as the blade bit through the side of his breastplate, drawing blood. Arthur thought he saw Robert stagger for the briefest instant, but then the Storm Lord roared and pivoted on his heel, swinging the warhammer in a savage backhand that forced Rhaegar to leap backward. Arthur, seeing his chance, lunged again, but Robert's hammer was already coming around for him now. The momentum, the unstoppable weight of that hammer, was something Arthur realized he must respect. He raised Dawn to parry, bracing for impact. The shock of the blow traveled up Arthur's arms, rattling his teeth. He managed to hold his ground, though the force forced him back a step in the muddy terrain. Robert did not relent, bringing the hammer up and down in a punishing vertical strike. Arthur rolled to the side, his white cloak stained with mud and blood, but still intact. He slashed upward, carving a deep groove in Robert's hammer haft, close to the head. Robert bellowed in frustration, but rather than retreat, he redoubled his assault. Arthur and Rhaegar were forced to move in tandem, one attacking as the other pulled back. Despite the disparity in size and raw strength, Robert was holding his own against 2 of the greatest warriors of the age. The rebel lord fought like a man possessed, each blow fueled by hatred for House Targaryen, by grief for the events that had sparked this rebellion, and by the raw determination of a warrior who refused to break. For what felt like an eternity, the 3 men danced on the edge of mortal peril. Around them, the broader battle raged, but in that space, the war narrowed to a single focus: kill or be killed. Time seemed to stretch thin, each heartbeat an epic unto itself. Arthur could sense Rhaegar's exhaustion, saw the flicker of desperation in the prince's eyes. This was not a knightly tourney. This was not about to be ended by submission or yield. It was a fight for the Iron Throne's future. Arthur, though pressed, maintained his composure. Dawn felt like an extension of his body, the sword's unusual lightness enabling him to strike swiftly and recover with minimal effort. But Robert's hammer might as well have been a giant's club, and each time Arthur or Rhaegar tried to close in, it threatened to pulverize them. The ground beneath their feet churned into a slick mess of mud and gore. Then, an opening. Robert raised his warhammer high, intending to bring it down upon Rhaegar with devastating might. Rhaegar raised his sword to parry, but Arthur, seeing that the blow would simply be too strong, intervened. He swung Dawn in a diagonal strike aimed at Robert's arm, hoping to force the rebel lord to abort his attack. Robert saw the danger, twisted his torso, and turned the downward strike into a sideways slam intended for Arthur instead. Arthur, eyes wide, had only an instant to shift his balance. The hammer clipped his left pauldron, shattering the armor plate and sending a lance of pain down his arm. Had Robert's aim been true, it would have crushed Arthur's shoulder entirely. Still, Arthur was knocked off his feet, crashing onto his back. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and his vision blurred. Distantly, he heard Rhaegar shouting his name. Summoning what remained of his breath, Arthur rolled to evade the next blow. It never came. Rhaegar had drawn Robert away for a split second, giving Arthur time to scramble upright. His left shoulder burned and throbbed, but he forced himself to ignore it. He raised Dawn again, grateful the blade was still in his grip. For a moment, he had feared he might lose it, an unthinkable prospect. Robert let out a growl, sweat and blood streaming down his face. "1 man or 2, Targaryen, I'll end you," he snarled at Rhaegar, though Arthur could see that Robert's breathing was heavy, his stance beginning to stiffen. "And you, Dayne, you're no ghost in white to me. I know your repute, but you'll bleed as all men do." Arthur said nothing. His training had taught him not to waste breath in boasts or threats on the battlefield. Words would not fell a foe, though a well-aimed sword might. And so he pressed in once more, forcing Robert's attention. Robert obliged, turning with a wide swing that Arthur sidestepped. Then came Rhaegar, lunging from the other side, forcing Robert to give ground. But Robert did not give ground for long. He stepped back only to gain the space needed to hurl his warhammer in a short throw at Rhaegar. It was an unconventional move, but it bought him an instant. Rhaegar managed to deflect the spinning hammer with his sword, though the force tore the weapon from his grip. Rhaegar fell backward, leaving him momentarily disarmed. Robert, quick as a hunting cat, reached out and caught the returning hammer by its haft, now chipped where Dawn had scored it, but still lethal. He advanced on the prince, who scrambled to regain his sword from the mud. Arthur seized the opportunity. With a cry, he lunged at Robert's unprotected flank. He aimed for a gap in the armor, a fatal thrust under the arm. Robert, forced to defend, pivoted and intercepted Arthur's strike with the hammer haft. The collision jarred Arthur's injured shoulder, sending fresh agony through his body. The moment's delay allowed Robert to slam the pommel end of the hammer into Arthur's torso. The blow was like a thunderbolt. Arthur felt his ribcage groan in protest, but his armor prevented it from being a killing strike. Arthur staggered and nearly collapsed, but a deep resolve kept him upright. He snarled, fighting through the pain. This man was unstoppable, fueled by a fury that seemed never-ending. Arthur dared a glance at Rhaegar, who was on one knee, groping through the wet earth for his sword. The prince's gauntlet closed around the hilt at last, but Robert was already bearing down on him once more. In the pounding of blood in his ears, Arthur realized the next few heartbeats would decide everything. If Robert killed Rhaegar here, the rebellion would be won in a single savage moment. The Targaryen cause would lose its shining prince, and the realm would drown in the fires of vengeance or the ashes of a fallen dynasty. With no time to hesitate, Arthur forced himself forward. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one igniting white-hot pain in his chest. He reached Robert just as the Storm Lord began a downward swing aimed at the prince's skull. Arthur slapped the warhammer aside with the flat of Dawn, driving all his remaining strength into that one move. The momentum was enough to deflect the blow, causing the hammer's head to smash into the mud next to Rhaegar. Rhaegar, seizing the chance, thrust his sword upward, aiming for Robert's abdomen. But Robert twisted at the last second, so the blade merely glanced off his side, drawing blood but not a mortal wound. "Fall, damn you!" Robert roared at Arthur, flinging a punch that connected solidly with the side of Arthur's helm. Sparks danced in Arthur's eyes. He stumbled, the world spinning. Yet even through the haze of pain, Arthur retained enough presence of mind to keep moving. He sank to one knee, bringing Dawn up in a guarding stance. Robert, perhaps sensing an easy kill, advanced on Arthur. But that was when Rhaegar struck, with a desperate, savage blow from behind. The prince's sword sliced through the back plate of Robert's armor, drawing a deep wound that caused the rebel lord to cry out. Arthur did not waste the opening. Gathering his last vestiges of strength, he drove forward, pushing Dawn straight through the rent in Robert's side. The rebel lord let out a guttural noise, half snarl, half howl, and staggered. Dawn was biting deep, and Arthur felt hot blood slick his gauntlets. Robert Baratheon's hammer tumbled from his grip, landing with a dull splash in the mud. For an instant, his eyes locked onto Arthur's, wide and incredulous, as though he could not believe he had been struck down. The moment was strangely silent. Time seemed to slow, the noise of battle fading into a distant roar. Arthur twisted the blade free, and Robert collapsed to his knees. Rhaegar, pale and wounded himself, stood over the dying rebel. Blood dripped from the edges of his sword and from the deep dent in his armor. Robert coughed, red froth bubbling from his mouth. He tried to form words, perhaps some final oath or curse, but only a wet, choking sound emerged. Then, Robert Baratheon toppled onto his side, eyes staring blankly at the sky. As though in answer, the sky unleashed a brief downpour, a curtain of rain that hammered both armies with cold insistence. Arthur sank to a sitting position, struggling to breathe through the waves of pain. He watched Rhaegar slump to the ground, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. The prince lived, but the cost had been high. Around them, the battlefield was still a chaos of men fighting, dying, and floundering in the mud. Yet word spread quickly, as it always did in the midst of war. Robert Baratheon was down. The rebel leader had fallen. It was not an immediate end to the battle. The rebels did not simply throw down their arms and flee. Some did, in blind panic at the sight of their champion's death, but others fought on, with the maddened desperation of cornered beasts. Arthur and Rhaegar did not have the luxury to bask in the relief of surviving the duel. They were forced to rally the loyalist lines, sending riders to signal a push that might break the rebellion entirely. Ser Barristan Selmy found them in the swirling mud, dismounted and spattered with blood that was not all his own. His normally calm gray eyes were wide with something akin to disbelief as they rested on Robert's corpse. Arthur noted the unspoken question in Barristan's gaze. Had they truly done it? Had the greatest threat to the Targaryen reign truly been felled? But there was no time for conversation. The war did not pause for men to confirm its turning points. With Robert's death, the command of the rebel forces fell to lords who were less charismatic, less influential, and less beloved by the rank and file. Confusion rippled through the rebel lines, though some leaders tried to impose order. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to abandon the fight. A few among them shouted for vengeance, demanded the heads of every Targaryen loyalist. A desperate call spread, "Kill the Dragonspawn, kill the Kingsguard." Arthur forced himself to his feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in his shoulder. He looked to Rhaegar, who likewise stood, though shakily. The prince met Arthur's eyes, and in that single exchange, Arthur understood that Rhaegar was steeling himself for what must come next, pressing the advantage, ensuring the rebel army collapsed. "Ser Arthur," Rhaegar managed to say, voice raw, "we must lead the charge, drive them back across the river." Arthur nodded, though his lungs burned. Rivulets of rain mixed with the blood on his face, and he could taste the metallic tang on his lips. His horse was nowhere to be seen, likely felled or gone astray in the melee, but he spotted a riderless destrier nearby. With effort, he limped through the mud toward it, Barristan and Rhaegar doing likewise. They mounted up once more, gathering around them a small cadre of knights, those who had survived the initial clash. The next hour was an unrelenting press. Loyalist drums resounded across the bank, horns signaling an all-out assault. Arthur rode beside Rhaegar, leading wave after wave of cavalry into the disorganized ranks of the rebels. Scenes of horror and brutality abounded on all sides. Men drowned in the river, weighed down by armor. Arrows found chinks in plate and mail. Unhorsed knights were trampled into the mud. The smell of death thickened the air, and screams formed a constant undertone to the pounding rain. Yet, in the midst of such carnage, the Targaryen banner advanced steadily. With Robert Baratheon dead, the morale of the rebels flickered. Some lords, seeing the tide turn, ordered a retreat to the eastern bank. Others fought on in defiance, preferring death to surrender. Arthur, battered and sore, fought like a man possessed, though no trace of arrogance graced his brow. He was a man fulfilling his duty, safeguarding the prince, holding the realm together by the slender thread of victory. Eventually, cracks began to appear in the rebel lines. A group of Northmen peeled off to protect the wounded Lord Eddard Stark, who had taken an arrow to the leg. Another contingent of knights from the Vale tried to rally, but were overwhelmed by loyalist forces under the command of Prince Lewin Martell, who had arrived mid-battle with reinforcements. Confusion reigned. Orders crossed and contradicted each other, and the impetus that had once driven the rebellion forward began to disintegrate. Amidst the chaos, Arthur's heart clenched when he spotted a pair of bodies that might have been old friends, fellow knights from tournaments past. In another life, they might have feasted together and exchanged stories of great deeds. Now, they lay face down in the muck, unrecognizable except for a torn sigil on a half-buried surcoat. Such were the wages of war, Arthur reminded himself, forcing his mind to remain focused on the present. At last, as the sun reached its zenith behind dark clouds, it became evident that the rebels were in full collapse. Loyalist forces swarmed across the field, capturing or killing any who continued to resist. A few pockets of fighting lingered, but the once mighty rebel host was disintegrating into a broken rabble. Some of the rebel lords who could still move or muster men tried to flee north or east, hoping to regroup or find another route to continue the war. But for many, the rebellion effectively ended on that blood-soaked bank of the Trident. Prince Rhaegar, streaked with mud and gore, at last called for a halt. He raised a hand, commanding that mercy be shown to those who laid down arms. More than a few men, weary and traumatized, sank to their knees in relief, discarding swords or axes, offering unconditional surrender. Arthur oversaw the capture of numerous rebel lords, ensuring they were not harmed. He knew some loyalists would wish to exact brutal vengeance, but Rhaegar's directive was clear. Those who surrendered were to be spared. When the final pockets of resistance had either fled or thrown down their weapons, the prince and his Kingsguard surveyed the field. Bodies lay everywhere, a grim testament to the price of war. The waters of the Trident were stained crimson, carrying downstream the blood of friend and foe alike. Arthur felt hollow, though he told himself that this was the cost to uphold his oath. He was no stranger to battle, but each life ended weighed upon him, like fresh iron chains clasped around his soul. Barristan Selmy, grievously wounded but upright, approached. "The field is ours," he said, voice subdued. "Robert is dead, your grace. The lords Tyrell and Martell will finish rounding up the rest of them. What would you have us do next?" Rhaegar looked around, eyes distant, as though seeing something beyond the ghastly scene before him. His hand idly fingered the cracked rubies on his breastplate. For a moment, Arthur worried the prince might collapse, given how pale he appeared. But then Rhaegar's expression resolved into steely determination. "We must press on to Harrenhal," he said quietly. "And from there, the Stormlands, the north, We have to ensure no new figure can rally them. But first, we must send word to the capital. My father must know the rebellion is ended." Arthur said nothing, but he wondered if the victory had come in time to spare the realm from the king's madness. He feared what might have happened in King's Landing during these months of chaos. He pushed the thought aside for the moment. Rhaegar continued, "Ser Arthur, Ser Barristan, see to the wounded. The small folk in these parts have suffered enough. Let them keep what they can. We must not behave like brigands." Barristan inclined his head in agreement. Arthur did likewise. They would do what they could to minimize the suffering of the common folk. But even in victory, war left an indelible stain. Arthur thought of all the mothers and fathers who would receive only the bodies of their sons, or no bodies at all if the river's current had swept them away. Before long, a cluster of mounted lords approached Rhaegar, seeking guidance or offering their congratulations. Lord Tyrell, grand in plate gilded with gold filigree, bowed over his horse's neck, acknowledging the prince's triumph. Prince Lewin Martell, Rhaegar's uncle, wearing the scorched white cloak of the Kingsguard, offered a weary smile. Lord John Cannington, Rhaegar's close friend, arrived covered in mud and blood, exulting, "We've done it, my prince. Robert is no more, and the day is ours." Yet Arthur noticed a strange hesitation in Rhaegar. The prince forced a tight smile, acknowledging their praise, but his eyes were already drifting across the field to the lifeless form of Robert Baratheon. Perhaps Rhaegar had expected more from this moment, some grand sense of relief or vindication. Instead, there was only the stink of death and the cold drizzle. In the next few hours, the Targaryen host set about gathering the dead, granting any final mercies needed, and making rough pyres for burning the corpses. Some noble lords, if recognized, were carried off separately so their families might reclaim them. Arthur, though exhausted, joined in the grim labor, directing men to pile the dead in rows, ensuring that knights of note were set aside if they could be identified. At one point, he came across the body of a lad who couldn't have been older than 16, eyes still open, face frozen in fear. The sight cut at Arthur's heart. He knelt briefly, closing the boy's eyes with a gentle hand. War seldom spared the innocent. When the last bodies were counted and the day began to wane, the Targaryen army made camp along the Trident. The fires of the pyres lit up the twilight sky. Everywhere, men nursed wounds or mourned fallen brothers, or simply stared into the distance, hollow from all that had transpired. Arthur found a moment's respite in a small tent set aside for the Kingsguard and High Lords. He removed the remnants of his battered armor, revealing black bruises on his shoulder and ribs. A maester fussed over him, applying poultices and bandaging cuts, marveling at how Arthur still managed to stand. Arthur let the maester work in silence, exhaustion draping him like a leaden cloak. Prince Rhaegar entered the tent then, accompanied by Ser Barristan. Rhaegar's armor had been removed, showing a linen shirt stained with blood and sweat. His face was drawn, the once bright eyes darkened by the day's horrors. He sat heavily on a stool near Arthur. "I owe you my life, Ser Arthur," Rhaegar said quietly after a moment. "Had you not intervened, Robert's hammer would have—" His voice trailed off. He did not finish the sentence, but they both knew how it would have ended. Arthur shook his head. "You owe me nothing, my prince. I am your sworn shield." But a small smile ghosted across his lips. "Yet I am glad I was able to keep my vow." Barristan nodded in agreement, folding his arms. The older knight had new scars on his face, a testament to the fierceness of the battle. We should also be mindful that Eddard Stark escaped. He was wounded, but his men carried him away. That man is honorable, but he is also loyal to Robert's memory. What might he do now? Rhaegar exhaled. "I do not know," he admitted. "He may flee north, try to rally more men. But without Robert, I doubt the north can sustain a prolonged rebellion on its own. The Vale may follow Lord Arryn, but their morale must be shattered as well. And the Riverlands, some of their lords were forced to fight for Robert, but with the rebellious Tully leadership cornered, they will likely yield. His gaze flicked to the tent flap, where the flicker of flames outside cast dancing shadows. "We will have to press our advantage. My father will demand swift action. But I must also think of the future. If we manage to keep the realm intact, how do we heal these wounds?" Arthur was silent. He knew how deep the hatred ran on both sides. Houses had lost heirs. Men had lost brothers. The name Targaryen was now stained in the eyes of many, and the Mad King's cruelties had only fueled the rebellion's fire. Even with Robert dead, resentment would linger. Rhaegar continued, his tone subdued. "Too much blood has been shed already. I had hoped perhaps this war could have ended sooner with fewer lives lost. But destiny, it seems, had another design." Barristan reached out and touched Rhaegar's shoulder gently, an uncharacteristic gesture of camaraderie. "You did what you must, Your Grace. War is never clean, but it is done, at least on this field. Tomorrow we look to the next." Night settled fully, and outside the tent, the funeral pyres continued to burn. Arthur, Rhaegar, and Barristan spoke quietly of plans for the coming days. They would dispatch ravens to King's Landing, to Dorne, to Highgarden, to Casterly Rock, and to other major seats, declaring the victory and urging the realm to bend the knee. A portion of the army would remain to secure the Riverlands while Rhaegar led a force east, anticipating that Stannis Baratheon might yet hold Storm's End. The shape of the realm's future rested on these maneuvers. Before taking to his bedroll, Arthur stepped out into the cold night air. He wandered past the rows of tents, acknowledging men who hailed him softly as Ser Arthur or Sword of the Morning. He noticed the fear and respect mingled in their eyes. They saw him as a hero, but he could not forget the torn corpses on the battlefield. Heroes were often just men who did what needed doing, he told himself, even if their hearts weighed heavy afterward. He reached the bank of the Trident, the moon's reflection dancing across the water. The stench of death still hung thick, but the water ran on, indifferent, as if it knew that men's battles were fleeting disturbances in a world far older than they. Arthur knelt near the water, cupping a handful to wash the grime from his face and hair. He scrubbed gently, hissing at the sting in his cut lip. When he looked up, the reflection staring back at him was etched with lines of fatigue. He barely recognized himself as the knight who had stood guard over Prince Rhaegar's wife and children not too long ago. He recalled the Tower of Joy, the white walls in the Red Mountains, and the promise he had made to keep a certain secret safe. Even now, the memory weighed upon him. He had come to the Trident to fulfill his sworn duty, but was that the only vow that mattered? He looked toward the east. Dawn, still sheathed, rested against his hip. The sword caught the moonlight, its pale surface momentarily gleaming like the morning star. He thought about the dreamlike prophecy Rhaegar believed in, the prince that was promised. So many had placed their hopes in these portents, yet the war had come down to steel and blood, as wars always did. Arthur whispered a silent prayer to the Seven, or to whatever force might be listening, that their choices here would not damn the realm to darkness. He rose, ignoring the renewed throb in his shoulder. Tomorrow he would ride with Rhaegar to secure their victory, to bring the rebels to heel, or at least to bring them to the table of peace. Tomorrow he would continue to be the shield, the sword, the guardian of House Targaryen's future. But tonight, on the banks of this river turned red, he allowed himself a moment of reflection, of doubt, of mourning for all that had been lost. Sleep came fitfully that night. He dreamed of the Tower of Joy, of white cloaks stained with blood, of a woman's cries echoing in the dark. He dreamed of a dawn sky that promised hope and despair in equal measure. And when he woke, cold sweat clinging to his temples, he remembered that he was the Sword of the Morning, but also a man, fallible, mortal, and bound by the choices made in a realm teetering on the brink of change. Morning brought new orders, new marching lines, and a renewal of purpose. Rhaegar did not tarry long at the Trident. Leaving a contingent of loyalist forces to secure the area, the prince led the main host eastward, toward Harrenhal, that looming fortress that had once been the stage for grand tourneys and whispered conspiracies. Arthur rode with him, stiff and battered, but uncomplaining. Duty was the bedrock on which he had built his life, and though it pained him, he would not forsake it now. The march took its toll on men who had already endured fierce combat. Supplies ran low, and the muddy roads slowed progress. Yet each night, ravens were sent ahead, carrying Rhaegar's proclamation of victory and promises of fair treatment for those who would surrender. Some lords, reading these messages, chose to bend the knee, sending envoys to treat with the prince. Others swore they would die before bending to the Targaryens again. Arthur was haunted by the question of how the North would react. Eddard Stark was a close friend to Robert, and though the man was known for his honor, Arthur suspected that the direwolves of Winterfell might not forget so easily. The captivity of Lyanna Stark, the events in King's Landing, the brutal fates that had befallen Brandon and Lord Rickard Stark, these were wounds that no parchment or treaty could mend overnight. Still, with Robert dead, the rebellion's impetus was gone. Lord Stark, if he lived, was likely to retreat to Winterfell, where the northern lords might focus on defending their own lands rather than striking south again. Perhaps, with time, the realm could be reconciled, though Arthur did not allow himself to dream too brightly. The Mad King still sat the Iron Throne, and Rhaegar's place in the line of succession was secure only if Aerys permitted it. On the third day's march after the battle, the Targaryen host reached the outskirts of Harrenhal. Smoke rose from some of the towers, a sign of occupation. With caution, scouts rode forth to ascertain the castle's state. They returned to report that the Lady Whent was still in residence, and no rebel army seemed to be garrisoned there. The gates were opened in surrender, or perhaps in relief that the loyalist army had come. Rhaegar and his banner lords rode in cautiously, finding the great hall nearly empty, with only a handful of staff and men-at-arms left to maintain the fortress. Arthur recalled the tourney at Harrenhal, years past, when Rhaegar had crowned Lyanna Stark as the Queen of Love and Beauty, an act that had set tongues wagging and hearts aflame. The ghosts of that moment still lingered in the charred corridors. One could almost hear the echoes of the crowd cheering, the music playing, the vibrant swirl of color. Now everything seemed gray and silent. War had a way of smothering the joys of the past, leaving only the dull ache of memory. They made camp in the ruins of Harrenhal's yard, for the castle's interior was dark and cold. Lady Whent, an aging woman draped in black, humbly offered what hospitality she could. Rhaegar accepted, though it was clear that Harrenhal held sour memories for him as well. Night fell, and the walls seemed to close in on the men like a tomb, but the weary soldiers were grateful for shelter from the elements. Arthur shared a brief evening meal with Rhaegar and several High Lords. They spoke of the next phase, riding south to King's Landing. By then, ravens from the city had come bearing messages from King Aerys. The king was exultant over the news of the victory, praising Rhaegar in florid language but also issuing contradictory commands about how to punish the traitors. Arthur knew better than to comment on the king's whims, but he could see Rhaegar's jaw tighten as he read the erratic demands. Rhaegar gave a single quiet remark to the assembled. "My father's instructions will be taken under advisement," he said calmly, though no one missed the subtle tension in his voice. When dawn came once more, they left Harrenhal behind and continued south. The relief of small folk along the way was palpable. They had feared for their lives and harvests, uncertain who might descend upon them next. Targaryen outriders assured the people that the war was all but won, that Robert Baratheon was slain, and that peace would soon return. A few rebellious lords, notably from the Stormlands and some from the Vale, still roamed the countryside, but they posed no large threat. Arthur found himself reflecting on the cost of this so-called peace. How many innocents had been devoured by the storm of war? How many grudges would fester, turning into future conflicts? Such thoughts weighed on him, but he kept them hidden behind a stoic facade. He was a Kingsguard knight, and his duty was to serve and protect. That was all. The day King's Landing came into sight, the host's mood turned uneasy. The city's walls rose up against the horizon, a sprawling mass of stone that guarded a population of tens of thousands. On the high hill, the Red Keep perched like a crimson sentinel. It was from there that Aerys Targaryen had watched the rebellion unfold, giving orders that had grown increasingly detached from any sense of reason. Arthur remembered the talk of wildfire caches rumored to be planted beneath the city. He prayed to the Seven that Ares had not done anything irreparable in his paranoid rage. Ser Barristan rode up alongside Arthur as they entered the city gate. "We must be vigilant," Barristan said in a low voice. "Who knows what the king's mood is, or what he might decree in his victory madness?" Arthur inclined his head, his expression grim. "We'll stand by the prince if it comes to it. I only hope it does not come to that." Soldiers lining the streets cheered the returning victors. They cried out Prince Rhaegar's name, some throwing flowers or scraps of cloth in celebration. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, a question unspoken but obvious. What sort of retribution would follow for those deemed traitors? Would King Ares reward the city with a day of jubilation or a day of bloody reprisals? As they passed through the outer wards, the stench of too many people living in squalor assailed them. No matter how often Arthur had been here, King's Landing always overwhelmed the senses. The noise, the smell, the crush of bodies. But the small folk were excited today, anticipating that the end of the war meant their bellies might be filled and their homes spared from pillage. The Red Keep loomed ahead, and once inside the courtyard, a contingent of gold cloaks greeted them. Lord Varys, the master of whisperers, appeared almost like a wraith, bowing deeply to Rhaegar with a serene smile. "Your Grace, the king awaits you in the throne room," he purred. "All of King's Landing rejoices at your triumphant return." Rhaegar nodded but said little, dismounting and handing his reins to a stable boy. Arthur followed suit, ignoring the flares of pain in his healing wounds. Together with Ser Barristan, they formed a protective flank around Rhaegar as he proceeded into the Red Keep's grand corridors. Courtiers clustered about, each trying to catch a glimpse of the famed victor, some calling out praises, others offering cautious smiles. They entered the throne room, its cavernous space echoing their footsteps. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, a twisted mass of melted swords. King Ares sat perched upon it, gaunt and pallid, his long nails tapping on the arm of the throne. His wild silver hair framed eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. Arthur felt the old familiar prickle of unease whenever he gazed upon the mad king. Rumors said that Ares had not left the Red Keep for the duration of the war, that he had burned alive anyone he suspected of treachery. The musk of fear and stale air clung to the walls. Rhaegar approached, flanked by Arthur and Barristan. The prince bowed, though his posture was notably stiff. "Father, the rebellion is ended. Robert Baratheon lies dead on the field of the Trident. Many rebel lords have bent the knee. The realm looks to you now to restore peace." Ares leaned forward, his gaze sliding over Rhaegar, then over Arthur and Barristan. A moment of silence stretched, thick with tension. Then the king's voice emerged, rasping and fraught with mania. "Yes, yes, my son the hero. You have done your duty at last." He cackled softly, then his face twisted into something cruel. "We shall have a grand celebration. We shall have a feast, and then we shall see the heads of all traitors mounted about the city walls. Their blood will feed the crows for a fortnight." Arthur held his breath, his gaze flicking to Rhaegar. The prince showed no outward reaction, though a tightness around his mouth betrayed his feelings. "Father," Rhaegar said carefully, "mercy can be a powerful tool to unite the kingdom. With Robert gone, many of the rebels will be content to surrender. We should." "Mercy," Ares hissed, voice rising in anger. "Is it mercy you showed them on the Trident? No, you slew them, you spilled their blood in the river. Traitors deserve only fire and blood. My son, have you forgotten they would have put your head on a spike, made a whore of your wife, and roasted your children on a spit?" Arthur felt a flicker of alarm at the king's ranting. He knew better than to speak in such a moment, but he placed a subtle hand on Rhaegar's arm, hoping to steady him. Rhaegar inhaled slowly, controlling his temper. "I have not forgotten, father," Rhaegar replied with forced calm. "Yet a ruler must also know when a gentler hand is needed to mend the wounds of war. Otherwise, we risk more bloodshed, more rebellions. The realm has bled enough." Ares sneered, He rose from the throne, his tattered robes swirling about him. "You dare lecture me on ruling, boy?" he spat. "I have ruled this realm while you played at prophecy and harp strings. I will decide who lives and who dies." His voice rose to a shriek. "I am the king, the dragon. Do you hear me?" The echo of his voice reverberated off the walls, and the assembled courtiers shrank back. Arthur's heart pounded. He dared a glance at Barristan, who wore a stony expression. This was the man they had fought to keep on the throne. Rhaegar did not cower. He did not flinch. Instead, he straightened, his eyes meeting his father's with a steady resolve. "You are the king," he said, voice controlled. "But remember, the realm looks to us for guidance. We have the chance to prevent further bloodshed, to unify these 7 kingdoms once more. Do not squander this chance in cruelty." For a long moment, Aerys stared, lips curled back like a feral beast. Arthur feared the king might order Rhaegar seized or burned alive for his defiance. He braced himself, thinking through all the possible ways this could erupt. The hush in the throne room was so complete that one could hear the faint rustle of tapestries in the distant corridors. Abruptly, Aerys threw back his head and laughed, a jarring, hollow sound. Then he slumped back onto the throne, as though some invisible force had deflated him. "Yes, yes," he muttered. "Unite the realm, my heroic son." He lifted a hand, dismissive. "Go, do as you will. But if any more traitors show themselves, they shall burn. Make no mistake about that." Rhaegar bowed stiffly, recognizing that he had won as much of a concession as was possible at that moment. He turned, and Arthur and Barristan followed him back down the long aisle. Whispers spread among the courtiers, and some parted in deference, others in fear. Arthur exhaled silently, relief flooding him that the confrontation had ended without violence. But he knew the king's madness was not abetted, only temporarily appeased. Outside the throne room, as they walked through the Red Keep's corridors, Rhaegar let out a shaky breath. "He'll never change," the prince said, voice laced with resignation. "We must prepare for the day when his madness endangers everyone." Arthur pressed his lips together. "I serve you and the realm, my prince. Whatever path you choose, you have my sword." Barristan nodded. "And mine, your grace." Rhaegar paused, studying them both, and a flicker of gratitude crossed his features. "We shall do what is necessary, but let us pray it never comes to open conflict between father and son. The realm cannot endure another war." They emerged into the courtyard, where knights and soldiers stood at the ready, awaiting further orders. Over the following days, Rhaegar and his advisors began to implement a cautious, conciliatory approach to the rebel houses. Ravens flew out, offering pardons and urging peace. Some houses accepted eagerly, preferring to live rather than continue a hopeless fight. A few scorned the offer, but their forces were too meager to pose a threat, especially with the crown's victorious army mobilized. Meanwhile, King Aerys presided over public punishments for those within the city walls deemed traitors. A handful of lesser lords who had been captured at the Trident were executed, their heads adorning spikes at the city gates. Arthur watched with a heavy heart, suspecting that Rhaegar's efforts at mercy were being undermined by his father's displays of cruelty. Each head rotting at the gate reminded the realm that the Targaryen king still had a thirst for vengeance. Over the next few weeks, the realm learned of Robert Baratheon's death. Storm's End, held by Stannis Baratheon, did not immediately surrender, but negotiations ensued. Stannis was a pragmatist. Surrounded by a large royal force and lacking significant allies, he eventually agreed to bend the knee in exchange for clemency. The terms were harsh, and Stannis was required to send hostages to King's Landing as a guarantee of his loyalty. In the north, Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell. He made no move to march south again, for without Robert, the cause was all but lost. Still, the North remembered. Time would tell whether their bitterness would fade or fester. For the moment, they accepted a cautious peace, though the Stark bannermen bristled at what they saw as the tyranny of the Targaryens. Arthur wondered if Rhaegar might someday travel north, try to mend the rift personally, though that day seemed far off. As the kingdom settled into an uneasy peace, Rhaegar took on more responsibilities in governance. King Aerys allowed it, seeming content to hole up in the Red Keep, surrounded by pyromancers and his paranoia. The city's small folk whispered that the real ruler was now Prince Rhaegar, and many of the lords agreed that they would prefer it so. Arthur stayed close at Rhaegar's side, ever vigilant, aware that the king's unpredictability could erupt at any moment. Amid these delicate maneuvers, Arthur never forgot the secret he carried. The Tower of Joy still stood in Dorne, guarded by his brother knights who had not come to the Trident. He yearned for news, though he did not dare send a raven. The time might come when Rhaegar would have to confront that secret, for it might shape the realm's destiny even more than the rebellion had. Weeks turned to months. The aftermath of war slowly receded, though the scars remained. Lannisport resumed its trade, Highgarden sent harvest shipments to feed the war-weary capital, and Dorne quietly nursed its own grievances over losses sustained. The realm trudged forward, not quite prospering, but not tearing itself apart either. Rhaegar's crowning achievement came in the form of a great council he convened, inviting representatives from all the major houses to discuss the future. It was a bold move, one that hadn't been done in decades. Many were suspicious, fearing it a trap set by Aerys to gather traitors and burn them. But Rhaegar sent personal assurances that no harm would come, offering safe passage. The presence of Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selmy as guardians of peace lent credibility to the promise. Thus, lords and ladies from across the Seven Kingdoms came to King's Landing. Eddard Stark did not attend, claiming duties at Winterfell, but he sent his brother, Benjen Stark, as envoy. Stannis Baratheon arrived from Storm's End, grim and unyielding, but determined to represent the Stormlands. Jon Arryn attended, more out of duty than hope, his face hardened by the recent defeats. The Reach, the Westerlands, and Dorne all sent delegations. In the Red Keep's throne room, filled to capacity, Rhaegar stood forward, the king conspicuously absent. Rhaegar spoke of reconciliation, of a future where the wounds of the rebellion might heal. Some lords listened respectfully, others with skepticism. But it was Arthur Dayne's silent, watchful presence at the foot of the dais that underscored Rhaegar's sincerity. He was the sword of the morning, the knight who had bested Robert Baratheon himself, and the living embodiment of Targaryen power and prestige. If Arthur Dayne believed in Rhaegar's vision, perhaps there was hope. The council was not without conflict. Accusations and old grievances were aired openly, an unprecedented spectacle in front of the realm's great lords. Voices were raised in anger, and more than once Arthur and Barristan tensed, wondering if swords would be drawn. But Rhaegar maintained a calm composure, deflecting heated words with reason, offering small concessions where possible, and appealing to the lord's sense of duty to the realm. Over the course of 2 tense weeks, agreements were reached. Hostages were returned in some cases, reparations negotiated in others. The rebellious lords formally declared their fealty to the crown and were granted pardons. Many left King's Landing with clenched jaws, but they left in peace, not war. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start. Through it all, King Aerys remained in the Red Keep, seldom seen, rumored to be engrossed in his obsession with wildfire. Arthur, uneasy, thought of the rumor that caches had been placed beneath the city. For now, those rumors remained unconfirmed. But every so often, the king would appear unexpectedly, scuttling around like a half-mad spider in the halls, and the courtiers would fall silent in dread. When the council at last concluded, and the realm took its first shaky steps toward healing, Arthur found himself in the courtyard of the Red Keep, removing his helm after a ceremony that had officially crowned Rhaegar's infant son as Prince of Dragonstone. Rhaegar had presided, while Aerys watched from his throne, eyes gleaming with some inscrutable thought. Arthur had felt a strange tingle in the air, as if 1,000 new possibilities had opened for House Targaryen. Yet underlying it all was the knowledge that a single spark of the king's madness could ignite the realm once more. In the fading evening light, Rhaegar approached him. The prince looked tired but content. "Sir Arthur," he said softly, You have been with me through the worst of this war. I am grateful beyond measure." Arthur bowed his head. "I am but your knight, your grace. My sword is yours, and so long as I draw breath, I will do all in my power to safeguard you and your family." Rhaegar's gaze flicked over the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the city's walls. "The realm still bleeds, but perhaps now we can begin to bind the wounds. Yet there is something else. I sense that our destiny is not yet complete, that my father's madness remains a threat." He paused, then added in a hushed tone, "And there are secrets I must address, Arthur, matters that could change everything." Arthur felt his chest tighten. He knew, of course, that Rhaegar referred to the Tower of Joy and all it entailed. But here in the courtyard, with the hush of impending night around them, he said nothing. Rhaegar continued, his voice low, "I will rely on you, my friend. When the time comes, I will need you to stand beside me once more." Arthur met the prince's eyes. "Always," he swore, meaning every word. They parted then, each thoughtful. Arthur walked alone through the courtyard, passing torches that sputtered in the evening breeze. He could still sense the ghosts of the war just past, the clang of steel, the cries of the dying. And yet, for a brief moment, he felt a cautious hope. The rebellion had been quelled. The realm was not entirely broken. Perhaps, guided by Rhaegar's hand, the Seven Kingdoms might find a measure of peace that could endure. But Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, knew better than to trust in fleeting illusions. War had been averted for now, but the shape of things to come would depend on how Rhaegar navigated his father's madness, how the realm's lords responded to the memory of rebellion, and how secrets long kept might surface. He walked on, hearing the distant murmurs of voices in the Red Keep, the scuff of his boots on the stone. Dawn, sheathed at his side, was a silent companion, as it had always been. In the distance, he could see the flicker of lights in the Tower of the Hand, where Rhaegar would no doubt be conferring with his allies, shaping the next steps. Arthur thought of the silent vow he had made when he left the Tower of Joy to answer Rhaegar's call. He had promised to do his duty, no matter the cost. Today, that duty had brought him to the heart of the realm's power, entwined him in battles both physical and political. Tomorrow, it might take him elsewhere, to a lonely tower in Dorne, or to a new battlefield if the king's madness sparked another conflict. For now, though, he had helped secure a victory that might shape the fate of the Targaryen dynasty for generations. If destiny had decreed that Arthur's place was on the Trident that day, ensuring Robert Baratheon fell beneath Dawn's pale edge, then so be it. He had made his choice, acted on his oath. The realm had been spared a rebel's triumph, though time would tell if it had instead inherited a mad king's tyranny. Night settled over King's Landing, cloaking the city in a darkness punctuated by torchlight. Arthur Dayne, clad in the white cloak of the Kingsguard, made his solitary way along the ramparts, ever watchful. The hush of the night was broken only by the sigh of the wind against the battlements. He paused at a crenel, gazing out over the sprawling city, thinking of the countless souls who slept in uneasy peace, unaware of how close they had come to devastation. He let out a breath, steady and measured. He was tired, but a Kingsguard night's watch was never truly done. If Rhaegar's victory at the Trident had saved the realm this day, the next day's trials would soon come. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the swirl of the battle, the fatal thrust that ended Robert Baratheon. Had it not been for his intervention, everything might be different. The war might still rage. The realm might have a different king. What if it had gone another way? That question hovered for a single heartbeat before Arthur opened his eyes again, banishing it like a ghost at dawn. There was no time for such thoughts. The realm needed him here, now, on this path. He rested a hand on Dawn's hilt, the pale blade resonating with a quiet certainty. He was the Sword of the Morning, and his duty was to guard the realm's future, wherever that duty led him next. And so he kept his silent vigil, as the stars turned overhead and the city below slept, oblivious to the shape of tomorrow.